Sometimes love takes a dark and dangerous turn. What starts as a passionate affair can quickly spiral into obsession, and in this story it ends in murder. Nia Stokes, a wealthy 45-year-old woman, became fixated on her young lover, Zane Rivers, who was barely half her age. Their relationship, built on gifts and promises, seemed like a dream for Zane at first, but soon, the weight of Nia's control became too much to bear. On the outside, Nia appeared to be living the perfect life, but beneath the surface, her obsessive need to control Zane grew darker. As Zane tried to distance himself, tensions rose, leading to a horrifying confrontation that would change everything. What started as a secret affair turned into a deadly game, and by the end, one person would pay the ultimate price. This is the story of how love turned into a dangerous obsession and how it all led to a brutal murder. Let's unravel the events that led to this chilling crime. Nia Stokes was a woman who had everything: money, power, and the freedom to live life on her own terms. At 45, she had built a successful business and enjoyed the luxuries that came with it. But behind her glamorous facade was a woman who craved something more, something that money couldn't buy. She was lonely, and that loneliness led her down a dark path when she met Zane Rivers. Zane was just 22, a young man trying to make a name for himself in the world. He came from a modest background, working odd jobs to support himself while figuring out what he wanted to do with his life. That's when Nia spotted him at a high-end event she had been attending. He was serving drinks, his easygoing smile and youthful charm catching her attention. It wasn't long before Nia struck up a conversation with him, her interest quickly turning into something deeper. At first it seemed innocent. Nia offered Zane opportunities, money, gifts, vacations. She made him feel special in ways no one else had before. Zane, drawn to her wealth and the lifestyle she could provide, went along with it. He saw it as a way to escape the grind of his daily life. They began spending more time together, and soon, Zane became her lover. What started as an exciting fling for Zane quickly turned into something more sinister as Nia's obsession with him grew. She showered him with gifts, but it came with a price. Nia wanted control over his life, his time, and ultimately over him. Zane began to feel trapped, but he didn't know how to escape without losing everything Nia had given him. The signs of Nia's obsession became clearer over time. She would call Zane multiple times a day, showing up unexpectedly at his apartment, and demanding to know where he was and who he was with. Zane's friends began to notice the change in him. He became withdrawn, nervous, and started avoiding social gatherings. When they asked him what was going on, he would shrug it off, saying he was just tired from work. Behind the scenes, Zane was starting to realize the dangerous situation he was in. Nia's mood swings became more frequent. One moment she was showering him with affection, and the next she was accusing him of not caring enough, of being ungrateful for everything she had done for him. Zane felt like he was walking on eggshells around her, never knowing what would set her off. Despite his growing unease, Zane couldn't break free. Nia had woven herself into every aspect of his life. She paid for his apartment, bought him a car, and even promised to help him start his own business. Zane felt indebted to her, but the more he tried to pull away, the tighter her grip became. Things took a darker turn when Nia began isolating Zane from his friends and family. She would make up excuses for why they couldn't attend events together, why it was better for him to spend time with her instead. Zane's world was shrinking, and he was becoming more and more dependent on Nia. It wasn't long before Zane's friends started to question the nature of his relationship with Nia. One night, after a particularly tense argument with her, Zane confided in his best friend, telling him how Nia's behavior was becoming unbearable. His friend urged him to leave, but Zane wasn't sure how. Nia had given him everything, but now it felt like she had taken control of his life. Meanwhile, Nia's obsession reached new heights. She began tracking Zane's movements, going through his phone when he wasn't looking, and demanding to know who he was texting. Zane's attempts to set boundaries were met with anger and emotional manipulation. Nia would cry, accusing him of not loving her, of using her for her money. Zane was caught in a web of guilt, fear, and confusion. The relationship, which had once seemed exciting and full of promise, had now become a nightmare for Zane. He was desperate to escape, but he didn't know how to break free without facing Nia's wrath. She had become possessive, jealous, and controlling, and Zane feared what she might do if he tried to leave. One fateful night, after another argument, Zane made a decision. He couldn't live like this anymore. He had to find a way out, even if it meant walking away from everything Nia had given him. He planned to meet with Nia the next day to end things once and for all. Little did he know, that decision would set off a chain of events that would lead to tragedy. Nia, sensing Zane's growing distance, had been watching him closely. She knew something was wrong, and the thought of losing him drove her to the edge. She couldn't bear the idea of him leaving her, of living without the man she had become obsessed with. And in her mind, if she couldn't have him, no one else would. As Zane prepared to confront Nia and end their toxic relationship, he had no idea just how far she was willing to go to keep him. What followed would be a shocking and violent end to their story, a story that started with love and lust, but ended in bloodshed. This was no ordinary breakup. It would become a case that would leave everyone who knew them horrified and questioning how things could have gone so wrong. But for Nia, it was clear she would rather destroy everything than let Zane go. As the events of that final night unfold, the chilling reality of Nia's obsession becomes clear. The line between love and possession had been crossed, and the consequences would be deadly. Zane woke up the next morning with a sense of dread weighing heavily on him. He had decided that today was the day he would finally end things with Nia, but it wasn't going to be easy. He could already imagine the emotional storm that was about to hit Nia's accusations, the tears, and perhaps even worse. Still, he couldn't go on like this. The relationship had turned into a prison, and he was determined to break free. As the hours ticked by, Zane rehearsed what he would say. He tried to stay calm, reminding himself that this was the only way to regain control of his life. He packed a small bag, intending to stay with a friend for a few days until the dust settled. His hands trembled as he zipped up the bag, knowing full well that Nia wouldn't let go without a fight. Nia had been acting strange for the past few days. Her mood swings were more intense, and her need to know where Zane was at every moment had become suffocating. She could sense that something was changing in him. He was more distant, less responsive, and she hated it. Every time she called, she feared he wouldn't pick up, and the anxiety gnawed at her constantly. In her mind, if Zane left her, her entire world would crumble. That evening, Zane texted Nia asking if they could talk. He knew it would be best to have the conversation in person, but he didn't want to go to her house, where she had the upper hand. Instead, he suggested meeting at a quiet park just outside the city. Nia agreed, but even through the text, Zane could feel her unease. Zane arrived at the park first, sitting on a bench by the small pond where they had once spent peaceful afternoons together. The memories of those early days of their relationship, when everything had seemed exciting and carefree, felt like a lifetime ago. Now, he was just waiting for it to end. Nia arrived shortly after, stepping out of her sleek black car. Her appearance was as flawless as always, dressed in expensive clothes, her makeup perfectly applied. But there was something in her eyes that unnerved Zane. Her gaze was intense, filled with a mix of desperation and anger. As she walked toward him, Zane could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He stood up, bracing himself for the confrontation. Without wasting time, he began to speak, explaining that things weren't working out, that he needed space, that they were better off apart. He kept his voice as calm and steady as possible, but inside, he was terrified of how Nia would react. Nia didn't say a word at first. She just stared at him, her eyes narrowing as she processed his words. Her breathing quickened, and the tension between them grew thicker with every passing second. Finally she spoke, her voice low and controlled, but with an edge that sent chills down Zane's spine. Zane tried to explain himself, but Nia wasn't listening. Her emotions were bubbling just beneath the surface, ready to explode. She stepped closer, her expression shifting from anger to something more dangerous and eerie calm that Zane had never seen in her before. It was as if something had snapped inside her. Zane backed away slightly, sensing that the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. He told her that he was leaving, that he didn't want to fight, but Nia's face twisted with rage. She accused him of using her, of leading her on, of planning to leave her all along. Her words were sharp and venomous, and Zane struggled to keep his composure. Suddenly, Nia reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a small knife. Zane's eyes widened in shock as he realized the seriousness of the situation. He tried to calm her down, telling her that they could talk things through, but Nia was beyond reason. She stepped toward him with the knife in her hand, her eyes wild with anger and betrayal. Zane panicked, pleading with her to put the knife down, but Nia's grip on the blade only tightened. In that moment, Zane knew that she wasn't thinking clearly. Her obsession had consumed her, and she was ready to do whatever it took to keep him from leaving. What happened next unfolded in a blur. Nia lunged at Zane, and he instinctively tried to grab her wrist to stop her. They struggled, both of them falling to the ground as they fought over the knife. Zane could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he wrestled with her, desperately trying to avoid the blade. The scene was chaotic grunts, shouts, and the sounds of their struggle echoing through the empty park. For a brief moment, Zane thought he had the upper hand. He managed to push Nia off him and scrambled to his feet, but as he turned to run, he felt a sharp, searing pain in his side. He looked down to see the knife buried in his flesh, Nia standing behind him with a look of twisted satisfaction on her face. Zane staggered, clutching his wound as blood poured from his side. He stumbled forward, trying to get away, but his strength was fading fast. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath as the pain became unbearable. Nia stood over him, her chest heaving with each breath, her hand still gripping the bloody knife. For a moment she seemed to realize what she had done. Her expression shifted from rage to horror as she looked down at Zane, who was now barely conscious. She dropped the knife, her hands trembling as she backed away from his body. The weight of what had just happened began to sink in, and Nia's mind raced. This wasn't how things were supposed to end. She loved him, didn't she? Or was it something else? Something darker. Her obsession had blinded her, and now there was no going back. Zane lay motionless on the ground, his vision blurring as the world around him faded. In his final moments, he wondered how things had gotten this far, how a relationship that had once seemed so full of promise had ended in such tragedy. As Nia stood there, frozen in shock, she realized that her perfect life had just unraveled in the most horrific way. The man she couldn't bear to lose was gone, and the blood on her hands was proof of the lengths she had gone to keep him. The park, once a place of peace and quiet, had now become the scene of a murder, a crime born out of obsession and desperation. And for Nia, there was no turning back. What had started as a passionate affair had ended in a grisly murder, and the consequences would follow her for the rest of her life. The once quiet park, now stained with blood, remained eerily silent after Zane's final breath left his body. Nia stood frozen, still in shock at what she had done. She stared down at Zane's lifeless form, her mind racing between disbelief and panic. How had it come to this? How had the relationship spiraled so far out of control? The weight of her actions pressed down on her like a crushing wave, but there was no escaping the reality of what had just happened. Nia's first instinct was to run, but she couldn't move. Her legs felt like they were glued to the ground as she stood over Zane, his body lying in a pool of blood. The knife, which had once felt so powerful in her hand, now lay discarded beside him, covered in his blood. She had always been in control of her life, her career, her relationships. But now, everything was shattered. After what felt like hours, Nia's mind finally snapped into action. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed a number she knew by heart. Not the police, no, she wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, she called Claire Barlow, her close friend who also happened to be a detective. Claire would know what to do. Claire would help her figure out how to fix this. Claire was in her office, wrapping up a long day, when she saw Nia's name flash on her phone. Her initial reaction was one of surprise. Nia rarely called, especially this late. Claire answered the call, her voice steady as she greeted her friend. But the moment Nia spoke, Claire knew something was terribly wrong. Nia's voice trembled, her words coming out in a panicked rush. Claire immediately felt a sense of dread. She had known Nia for years and had seen the signs that something was off in her relationship with Zane. But this was far worse than she had ever imagined. Without asking too many questions over the phone, Claire rushed to the park where Nia had said it all happened. Her instincts as a detective kicked in, but the emotional side of her, the part that had been Nia's friend for years, couldn't comprehend what she was about to face. She arrived at the park within minutes, parking her car just outside the entrance and quickly making her way to the scene. When Claire saw Nia standing over Zane's body, her heart sank. The sight of the blood, the knife, and the lifeless young man was enough to send chills down her spine. This wasn't just a crime, it was a tragedy. Claire had worked on countless cases of violence, but seeing someone she knew so personally involved in something so horrific left her reeling. Her emotions were torn between her duty as a detective and her connection to Nia. Claire approached slowly, her eyes scanning the scene as she tried to piece together what had happened. Nia was still in shock, standing like a statue as tears streamed down her face. Claire knew she had to act fast, but she also knew that this situation was delicate. She couldn't let her personal feelings get in the way of the investigation. Nia stammered as she tried to explain what had happened, but her words were fragmented, her mind still in a state of chaos. Claire listened patiently, but her attention was already shifting to what she needed to do next. She knew she had to call for backup and secure the crime scene, but she couldn't help but feel a wave of sympathy for Nia, even as she stood there with blood on her hands. Within minutes, other officers arrived at the scene. Detective Max Harlow, a seasoned investigator who had worked with Claire for years, took over the official investigation. Max was no stranger to gruesome crime scenes, but even he felt the weight of this one. A young man murdered in a moment of madness, and the perpetrator a wealthy, well-known woman who had seemingly lost control. It was the kind of case that would make headlines for weeks. Max and Claire worked together, gathering evidence while keeping Nia at a safe distance. Nia was quickly taken to the police station for questioning, though Claire insisted on accompanying her, knowing that Nia was fragile and on the verge of a complete breakdown. Despite her personal feelings, Claire knew she had to remain professional. She couldn't afford to let her friendship with Nia cloud her judgment, not with a murder investigation on the line. At the station, Nia sat in a small interrogation room, her hands trembling as she tried to collect her thoughts. She had never imagined herself in a place like this, under the harsh glare of police lights, with officers watching her every move. The reality of what she had done was beginning to sink in, and the panic that had gripped her in the park was now giving way to overwhelming guilt. Detective Max led the questioning, his tone firm but calm. He asked Nia to walk him through the events of that night, how she and Zane had met at the park, how the argument had escalated, and how things had gone so horribly wrong. Nia struggled to answer, her voice cracking as she recounted the fight, the knife, and the fatal moment when she had stabbed him. It was clear that she wasn't trying to hide what had happened, but her version of the events was chaotic and fragmented. Max took notes, but his mind was already racing ahead, thinking about how the case would play out in court. Nia's social status, her wealth, and her connection to powerful people would all come into play. The media would have a field day with this story, and there would be no escaping the public scrutiny that would follow. Meanwhile, Claire stood just outside the room, watching through the glass. She felt a deep sadness, not just for Zane, who had lost his life, but for Nia, who had thrown hers away in a moment of madness. Claire had seen this kind of thing before: obsession, jealousy, and rage, all boiling over until someone ended up dead. But seeing it happen to someone she cared about made it all the more difficult to bear. As the questioning continued, Max pressed Nia on the details of her relationship with Zane. He needed to understand the full picture. How had things gotten so out of control? Nia admitted to her obsession, explaining how she had felt possessive of Zane, how she had feared losing him. She spoke of her jealousy, her anger, and the growing frustration that had built up over the months. But even as she spoke, she struggled to make sense of her own actions. How had she let it go this far? The investigation moved quickly, with evidence being collected from the park and from Nia's personal belongings. Forensics teams worked late into the night, analyzing the bloodstains, the knife, and Zane's phone, hoping to uncover any additional clues that might shed light on what had led to the tragic confrontation. Meanwhile, Zane's friends and family were notified of his death, their grief compounded by the shocking circumstances. As the case unfolded, more details about Nia and Zane's relationship came to light. It became clear that the relationship had been toxic from the start, built on power, manipulation, and control. Zane's friends came forward, sharing stories of how he had become distant, how he had expressed fear and frustration about Nia's possessiveness. They spoke of the emotional toll it had taken on him, how he had tried to break free, but couldn't. For the detectives working the case, the story was becoming clearer. Nia's obsession with Zane had grown to dangerous levels, and when she felt him slipping away, she had acted out of desperation. What should have been a breakup had turned into a murder, and now, Nia was facing the full weight of the law. But even as the investigation reached its conclusion, there were still questions that lingered, questions that only Nia could answer. What had driven her to that final fatal act? Was it pure obsession, or had something deeper been at play? The answers might never fully come to light, but one thing was certain: Zane was dead, and Nia's life, once so perfect, was now in ruins. As the investigation wrapped up, the spotlight shifted to the courtroom, where Nia Stokes would stand trial for the murder of Zane Rivers. The media frenzy surrounding the case had grown with each passing day, and soon the entire country seemed to be following the tragic story of the wealthy, obsessed woman and her young lover who met a grisly end. Reporters lined up outside the courthouse, eager for any new development, while public opinion remained sharply divided. Some viewed Nia as a victim of her own mental instability, while others saw her as a manipulative woman who had destroyed a young man's life. Inside the courtroom, tension was high. Nia sat at the defense table, her once confident demeanor now replaced with a sense of vulnerability. She looked fragile, her eyes hollow from weeks of sleepless nights. The weight of the trial and the reality of her actions had taken a toll on her. She knew the trial would decide not just her future, but also how the world would remember her. The prosecution wasted no time painting Nia as a woman consumed by jealousy and control. They laid out a clear timeline of events, focusing on how Nia had manipulated Zayn with gifts, money, and promises, only to turn on him when he tried to escape her grasp. The prosecution's star witnesses included Zayn's friends, who tearfully recounted how he had become distant and scared in the months leading up to his death. They described his efforts to break free from Nia's control and how he had confided in them about her increasingly erratic behavior. One of Zayn's closest friends took the stand, describing a conversation they had shortly before the murder. Zayn had told him that he was planning to end things with Nia, but that he was scared of how she might react. The friend's voice cracked with emotion as he explained how he had urged Zayn to leave as soon as possible, but Zayn had been hesitant. He had felt trapped, torn between his desire for freedom and his fear of what Nia might do if he left. The forensic evidence was damning. The bloodstains on Nia's clothing, the fingerprints on the knife, and the messages between Zayn and his friends all painted a clear picture of a woman who had lost control. The prosecution argued that Nia's obsession with Zayn had turned deadly, and that she had planned the attack in a moment of rage when she realized she could no longer control him. Nia's defense attorney, however, tried to present a different story. They argued that Nia had acted in self-defense, claiming that the confrontation at the park had escalated and that Zayn had attacked her first. The defense painted Zayn as a young man who had taken advantage of Nia's generosity, using her for her money and lifestyle, only to turn on her when he no longer needed her support. They tried to portray Nia as a woman who had been pushed to the brink, emotionally fragile and mentally unstable due to years of loneliness and rejection. But the evidence against Nia was too strong. Witness after witness testified about her controlling behavior, her jealousy, and her increasingly erratic actions in the days leading up to the murder. Text messages between Nia and Zayn were read aloud in court, showing how she had become obsessive, tracking his movements and demanding constant reassurance of his loyalty. These messages painted a clear picture of a relationship that had been far from healthy, a relationship driven by power, control, and manipulation. Detective Max Harlow took the stand, providing key testimony about the crime scene. He described how the struggle between Nia and Zayn had played out based on the evidence they had gathered from the park. The positioning of the knife, the blood spatter, and the defensive wounds on Zayn's hands all indicated that Zayn had tried to defend himself in his final moments. Max's testimony was clear and precise, leaving little room for doubt about what had happened that night. The jury listened intently as the trial dragged on for days, each new piece of evidence adding weight to the argument that Nia's actions had been premeditated. The prosecution rested its case with a powerful closing statement, reminding the jury of Zayn's youth, his dreams for the future, and how those dreams had been cruelly cut short by Nia's obsession. The image of Zayn's lifeless body in the park, covered in blood, was seared into the minds of everyone in the courtroom. Nia's defense team tried their best to counter, pleading for leniency and painting her as a woman who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of emotional instability. They spoke about her history of mental health struggles, her loneliness, and how she had felt abandoned by everyone she had ever loved, but it was clear that the defense was fighting an uphill battle. The evidence was overwhelming, and Nia's attempts to shift the blame to Zayn did little to sway the jury. As the trial neared its conclusion, both the prosecution and defense made their final arguments. The jury was then tasked with deciding Nia's fate. The courtroom was silent as the jurors deliberated, everyone on edge as they waited for the verdict. Nia sat motionless at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face pale and emotionless. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and spectators, all waiting to hear what would happen next. Nia's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for the words that would seal her fate. The jury found Nia guilty of second-degree murder. The judge, following the verdict, sentenced Nia to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no outburst from Nia, no dramatic reaction, just a quiet acceptance as the realization of what her life had become set in. She would spend the rest of her days behind bars, a far cry from the luxurious life she had once enjoyed. For Zayn's family and friends, the verdict brought some closure, but the pain of losing him would never fully heal. His mother sobbed quietly as the sentence was read, clutching a photograph of her son. Zayn's friends embraced one another, their grief palpable, knowing that justice had been served, but wishing it had never come to this. As Nia was led away in handcuffs, the media outside the courthouse buzzed with activity, capturing the final moments of a case that had gripped the nation. Nia's story would be retold in tabloids, on television, and across social media, but for those who knew Zane, the focus would always be on the life that had been stolen too soon. For Claire Barlow, the detective who had once called Nia a friend, the case left a deep scar. She had seen obsession and jealousy turn deadly many times before, but this time it had hit too close to home. Claire would return to her job, solving cases, seeking justice for victims, but she would never forget the day Nia's life and Zane's had spiraled into tragedy. As Nia's sentence was handed down, the reality of her new life began to sink in. The once powerful, confident woman now faced a future behind bars, her freedom and luxurious life stripped away in an instant. The courtroom cleared, leaving behind an eerie silence that mirrored the devastation caused by her actions. Zane's family and friends left the courthouse, grappling with the bittersweet feeling of justice served but a life forever lost. His mother, devastated by the tragedy, struggled to find peace in the verdict. Zane's friends, who had witnessed the slow unraveling of his life under Nia's control, were relieved but heartbroken, knowing they could never get their friend back. As Nia adjusted to life in prison, she became a shadow of her former self. Her wealth and influence no longer mattered, and the walls of her cell became a stark reminder of the obsession that had led her there. The media eventually moved on to the next sensational story, but for those involved, the memory of that terrible night in the park would linger for years to come. Detective Claire Barlow, who had once considered Nia a close friend, found herself haunted by the case. She had seen the signs: Nia's growing fixation, her jealousy, but she never imagined it would lead to murder. Though she continued her work, seeking justice for others, the tragedy had left a permanent scar on her heart. The town where it all happened tried to move on, but the story of the wealthy woman who killed her young lover became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of what can happen when obsession turns deadly. Nia would spend the rest of her days in prison, a stark example of how quickly a life can spiral out of control when desire turns into something darker, more dangerous.